All right, I think we can perhaps start. So yeah, thank you for coming, everybody. My name is Anna Soer. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this very important panel. So let me introduce Mathieu Landriault, Professor Mathieu Landriault, the director of the Observatory de la Politique et de la Sécurité de l'Arctique, OPSA, as well as Professor Salminen, professor at the Arctic University of Norway. Thank you very much for joining this important panel on Northern Perception. This is what we hope to be the first annual survey of Northern perceptions on Arctic issues. I invite all of you to see previous reports that have been written by OPSA in the link that I'm sharing in the chat below. So yeah, I invite Professor Landriault and Professor Salminen to start.
Let me just share screen here. Okay. Thank you, Anna, for the introduction. We're gonna look at results today from a survey that we conducted in May. Of course, we'd like to thank the MINDS program of the Department of National Defence of Canada for funding this initiative. An important one, I think, because often we go to conferences, I think, when we're at Arctic events and we hear about what Northerners think, or Northerners think this way or that way, or are supportive of this or that. But there's very few empirical evidence to back this up other than anecdotal evidence. So that the purpose of this survey, of like Anna was underlining, I hope to be an annual tradition of surveying Northerners. We surveyed 609 Northerners residing in one of the three Northern Territories in Canada, so Yukon, Northwest Territories, or Nunavut, from May 8 to May 26, 2025. The number is a bit lower than from other polls, other national polls, because Northerners are a bit harder to reach, and it's a bit more expensive to reach Northerners. That's why I think this initiative is so valuable, to put in the efforts and to put in the resources to really have a good idea of how Northerners in Canada think about Arctic issues. So we're going to look at issues that are related to Arctic governance, Arctic security, and Arctic development in general. The questions are kind of could be categorized in two big categories: those that have to do with kind of more Arctic strategic context or the Arctic strategic environment, and those that are more on Arctic policies and measures. I will present the one on more policies and measures, but I invite Professor Salminen to start looking at the Arctic strategic context questions.
Thank you, Mathieu. Can I have the next slide, please? Good. So one of our main questions about the context was that we asked the respondents to rate the extent to which you agree or disagree with the following statement. Canada must use its Arctic sovereignty or it will lose its part of the Arctic. And as you can see from the results here, close to 60% of respondents were strongly agreeing with this statement, and also close to 30% somewhat agreeing with the statement. Interestingly, for example, if we go further into how the results, how to say this, how you can divide them to as groups, and on the basis of the background information that we ask from people, the support for a stronger Arctic engagement gets higher in the older age groups, starting from the age group 55 all the way to the age group 75. The difference is not big, around 15%, but clearly the strongly agree group is from the older population. Yes, I think that was more or less what I wanted to point out on this first slide. We can move on to the next one. So the second question that is on my environment slide was a request from the respondents to ask what do they find as the most serious threat in the Canadian Arctic. Which of the following jurisdictions represent the most serious threat to the Canadian North? And interestingly, here as well, United States was seen as currently as the biggest threat to the Canadian Arctic, with a little bit over 37% of respondents being of this opinion. Then Russia was the good second, with a 35% of respondents highlighting the Russian threat, whereas China was coming third on around 17% of the respondents being of this opinion. Here we can say that the women were a little bit more of the opinion that United States is the biggest threat to the Canadian Arctic, whereas a majority of the male population found Russia as being the biggest threat to the Canadian Arctic. I'm not going through all the different divisions, but bringing up some of the most interesting ones that popped out in our analysis. Okay, and then the next one. The third environmental question was about when thinking about border and/or resource sharing disputes in the Arctic, which of the following statement comes closest to your point of view? The majority of respondents, over 60% here, being of the opinion that Canada should pursue a firm line in defending its sections of the Arctic. Around a little bit over 26% of the respondents being of the opinion that it's better to negotiate a compromise with other countries instead of defending strongly the position of Canada. And a little bit over 7% were of the opinion that national disputes over the Arctic are unnecessary, and then instead the whole region should be considered as an international territory. Here, when we look into the great age groups, it was mostly people under the age of 35 that considered this last option. National disputes over the Arctic are unnecessary. It should be an international territory. Support to this claim, 10% units higher than in other age groups. And then the next slide. Similar questions have been asked previously by other polls. Particularly this Gordon Foundation's Rethinking the Top of the World polls from 2010 and 2015. Here the sample has been the Northerners, but not only in Canada, but they are from the eight circumpolar countries altogether. And you can see here a little bit of an increase, for example, when it comes to the first statement that Canada should pursue a firm line in defending its sections of the Arctic, moving from 2010 around 41% to 2015 38%, being more or less the same, but jumping up to 62% in 2025. Similarly, there's been a decrease in support for the claim that it is better to negotiate a compromise with other countries, from around 46-47% to 26% in 2025 in this Canadian survey that we carried out now. And finally, national disputes over the Arctic are unnecessary. It should be considered as an international territory. There, the support, more or less, I would say, has remained the same, around 10%, a little bit under or a little bit over. And then the last slide about the environmental questions. Yes. So, which of the following statements comes closer to your point of view was our fourth question. depicting the Arctic environment. There are clearly close to 60% of the respondents were of the opinion that climate change is mostly caused by human activities. Around 22% of the opinion that climate change is mostly caused by natural changes and cycles. And then the cause of climate change is unclear, according to around 15% of the respondents. Here, there were not big divisions or in this responder groups that would be worth bringing up. So this is where people seem to be most unanimous. Thanks you.
Mm-hmm. So that's round up the strategic environment. And we focus a lot on threats. On the one hand, whether climate change or states, or the approach to take in relation to these threats, to border and resources threats. Now to the policy side, just more kind of specific policies and measures. We wanted to test the support of Northerners for specific measures that were enacted or that could be enacted in the North. We started with defense, important issue these days. Classic question of, do you think the government of Canada should spend more, the same amount, or less on the military, on defense spending? An overwhelming majority of respondents picked more, the more option. Definitely here, if we put that in relation with other polls done with Southerners in general, not just on Arctic, but on overall on defense spending, this kind of matched what we've seen in the past about year or so of very high support for defense spending. The less spending option is not so much where we saw a difference in the past year or two. It's really in the same amount category. So a lot of people that would have just said status quo is fine, same amount works for me, have tipped into the more military spending is necessary. We see that we see that nationwide. There was not a lot of data for Northern respondents. Now we have it that it seems to be the same consensus that we saw, that we are seeing in the rest of Canada. We're seeing it also in Canada's North about the need to invest more in defense spending. And even I should say that was done in May when there were already some increased defense spending announced. So there's still that sentiment that more needs to be done on top of what was announced, which is not surprising, but just reaffirm that perceived necessity by Canadians to invest more in defense spending. We didn't go into specific initiatives, defense initiatives that got support or not. Just a question format, number of questions limited our the number of questions we could ask. We then ask questions about natural resources. I think with national projects being discussed, it's important to talk about how do Northerners perceive the exploitation of natural resources. One interesting topic, when the oil and gas moratorium, so there's a moratorium since 2016 in the waters of the Canadian Arctic, to explore oil and gas. At first, when this was announced, we heard an uproar from some Northern leaders because of the lack of consultation. The measure, however, in a 2019 poll done by Environics, kind of showed that the level of support was at about 60% for the moratorium. So a majority of Northerners supported that idea that a moratorium was a good idea in the waters of the Canadian Arctic. We wanted to test, well, in this moment of talking about national projects, and when we talk about national projects, we talk a lot about oil and gas development. Would this moratorium be more undermined, or would people think that the moratorium should be lifted? That's not what we observed. It's still a strong 65% of respondents agreed that the moratorium was a good idea. And we saw support across territories. So a majority of respondents in all three territories agreed. In the Yukon and Nunavut at about the same level. Maybe the support eroded a bit in the Northwest Territories with more people disagreeing, but overall, strong majority of respondents back this idea. A bit to go on the social demographic that Professor Salminen raised. Gender was an interesting variable with more female respondents definitely backing the moratorium, male respondents less likely to back a moratorium. And interestingly enough, we almost saw a 50-50 divide for conservative voters, but still a majority, even of conservative voters in the North, agreed that the moratorium was a good idea. It was closer, it was kind of 53-47, but still a majority, even though a thinner majority agreed, of conservative voters agreed. Then we looked at mining, and mining is never an easy one to ask, especially because often I would prefer to ask maybe a question on mining projects, so a specific mining project. Do you agree with that mining project or that one? But in the North, those projects are so people are aware of certain projects around their communities, but they're probably not aware about projects that are in another territory. So we ask a general question about mining, presenting the pros, a lot of revenues, a lot of jobs for northern residents, royalties, etc. So there are pros. There are also negative consequences. So on the environment, of course, you don't do mining without some environmental damage, and on traditional indigenous customs. And that one could be highlighted, for example, if you follow the debate on the expansion of the Baffinland mine in Mary River. There were some questions raised by the Association of Trappers. So is mining a positive or a negative overall? Northerners are perceiving that mining in general is more seen from a negative lens. So 47% of respondents picked more the negative options outweigh the positives, while 37% thought the positive outweigh the negatives. We did a poll only polling Southerners, Southern Canadians in the last summer of 2024. That one was close to being 50-50. There was a 3% more respondents picking the negatives outweighing the positive. Here, the gap is at 10%. So it's more than 3 times. Northerners are more likely to perceive this as negative than Southern Canadians. On the demographics, not going to look at all of them, but the most significant one in our mind is the territorial variation that we observe. Definitely, there seems to be a specific more support for mining in the Northwest Territories. Makes sense if you consider the share of the Northwest Territories economy taken by mining, that it's seen more as a positive than a negative. However, even though in Nunavut, that kind of account for a lot of royalties and revenues and jobs, especially that Mary River mine, for example. For Nunavut residents, the negatives still outweigh the positive, even though they are probably kind of front seat to those positive consequences of jobs and royalties and revenues. There's still more residents of Nunavut thinking this is negative overall. We could go into other demographics, but gender, for example, was another big one. Female respondents being more likely to think the negative outweigh the positive, while male perceiving the opposite. And surprisingly enough or not, people making more than $150,000 were more of the opinion that mining was positive rather than negative. We don't say if they were linked to a mining site or not. We also asked a bit to capture, because so far in the first two, mining and oil and gas, we observe pretty pro-environmental or pro-environmental protection stance, backing the moratorium, seeing negative as more, mining as more negative than positive. We ask about federal contracts. What do you think should be the criteria to award contracts in the Canadian Arctic? Because of course the Canadian government is awarding a lot of contracts to provide goods and services. So should it go to the lowest bidder? Should it be a company that is based in the north, so north first approach, or should it be kind of a greener approach of let's pick the most environmentally friendly company that submitted a bid? Overall, the kind of pro-North approach seems to be the dominant one, the most popular one, followed by a greener approach to it, saying environment matters and it should be the main criteria. The lowest bidder, or the let's go for, taxpayers' money, if you will, or make sure it's we limit costs, were just a minority opinion defended by 7% of respondents. So overall, however, the fact that about 39% of people picked the environmentally friendly one still fits in the two previous slides of kind of pro-environmental protection, although it kind of makes sense from just an economic development perspective to kind of reward. You want companies in the north to be rewarded. So pointing to kind of maybe a north-south divide of let's prioritize northern companies and local companies before companies based, hundreds of kilometers away from our region. Hesitated to do the last question, but that was included. That was included back in April, to be honest. And I know we didn't hear a lot about it since. Although in the past month we heard that the U.S. were mounting an influence campaign in Greenland to kind of steer sovereigntist kind of feeling about separating from Denmark. We asked our respondents, what do you think should be Canada's preferred approach if Greenland is annexed with force by the United States? A few options, and we can talk about it in the Q&A about even what those options would even mean. Don't really know what Canadians support Greenland militarily would mean against a U.S. occupation or invading force. But anyway, the kind of traditional choices of military option or military approach, sanctions, diplomacy, and isolationism. Let's not do anything. Let's keep a low profile. Let's try to not alienate the United States. As you can see, and this is typical, and I can talk about more Canadian foreign policy when we ask respondents often, what do you think Canada should do about X, Y, and Z? And if you put a diplomatic option, it's often that one that will be the most popular. Still here, again, the most popular. Sanctions number 3, however, which would be surprising, often imposing sanctions is pretty high up the list of approaches that Canadians support in Canadian foreign policy, because it's often middle of the road. It's often we do something, but we're not doing too much or being too invasive or being too confrontational, but still we're doing something. But sanction is number 3, so it's kind of down the list. If you wonder how would that translate into territories, maybe all of these bars, the one to follow is the turquoise bar. This is Nunavut respondents. And for Nunavut respondents, the number 1 approach that Canada should adopt is to support Greenland militarily. Again, we didn't probe, and it was not an open question, follow-up question of what do you think that military support should be? So I don't think we would have had very specific answers to this, but still it's worth to note that for Nunavut resident, this is seen as a big deal. This is seen as something that we need to answer strongly, and we need to be forceful about. Because support Greenland military is clearly the #1 option between any diplomatic solution. And the two other territories, maybe it makes sense geographically that in the Yukon and Northwest Territories, they're a bit removed from Greenland. They're a bit away from Greenland, so it's maybe not perceived as such an immediate, would not be perceived as such an immediate threat. But for Nunavut residents, maybe something to highlight that in the likelihood that this would happen, we would hear a lot of anxiety probably and a lot of calls from Nunavut to do more or to do something forceful about such a move by the U.S. I'll stop here. Those are the main results that we uncovered. There's way more social demographic variations that were present, but I want to leave it at that to see if there are questions or interrogations about any of what the survey inquired. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mathieu and Mirva. There are some discussions in the chat already. So because this is a conference Teams, there is no possibility for participants to open their mic. However, if you leave a comment in the chat, I will be more than happy to read it out loud. So the first question that comes in is from Stacan. About mining, might it have been worth asking whether respondents already had some personal familiarity with mining projects and their impacts?
Yeah, this is something that we juggled with kind of what to ask. I should highlight that we were limited in the number of questions we can ask, not just kind of financially wise, but in terms of time. If you want to ensure that you have enough respondents, you cannot do a 25 to 30-minute survey because people will just, midway decide that they don't want to continue. For sure, I note the question would be definitely an interesting one to ask. We thought also of asking about specific projects, but like I said previously, for example, if you talk about the Mary River mine, maybe people in Nunavut or in Pond Inlet would be extremely familiar with that mine, but people in the Yukon would have no idea. So you would have a lot of don't know, don't want to answer response from our subjects. So definitely noting that it's an interesting one.
Thank you. A small precision. Peter is actually here on vacation and on his own time. He does not represent the agency. So thank you for the precision, Peter. Second question also from Peter. We've heard about a couple dimensions of sample demographics, and this is also of interest to me and several others in the audience. Is there also a dimension about indigeneity? So for instance, Inuit, non-Inuit, First Nation, or non-First Nation? Do you have any insight regarding this?
And maybe I could start, Mirva, if you want to complement some of the questions. Yes, so the question was asked, and we were going to leave the kind of more specific analyses for later publications. Definitely, there were some variations. What limit a bit the scope of what we can extrapolate is that the numbers are still pretty small. So if you look at the overall sample with 609 respondents, but if you break down into specific groups, then you turn into samples of 100 people or 150 or 200 respondents, let's say, that are First Nations. There were still variations, but on some questions, we didn't see spectacular variations of, let's say, Indigenous people thinking widely differently than non-Indigenous people. I don't know, Mirva, if you want to add to some questions related to Indigenous, non-Indigenous.
Yeah, I'm going through the statistics right now. I think wait a second. Yes, I think there is a one that pops up when it comes to the question about thinking about border or resource sharing disputes in the Arctic. Which of the following statement comes closest to your point of view? There's about 10% difference for the in such a way that the indigenous people are more in favor of the statement that national disputes over the Arctic are unnecessary and it should be considered as international territory. So there were some maybe worthwhile differences between non-indigenous and indigenous responses. Similar kind of differences come across, for example, when it comes to who is the biggest, which nation is the biggest threat to the Canadian Arctic. Russia was seen less of a threat amongst the indigenous people than amongst the main, like the general population who doesn't have an indigenous background. And then, whereas United States were seen more as a threat than within the indigenous respondents. So I would say these are the two that pop up in those environmental aspects or strategic environment aspects.
Thank you. We've had also a couple comments regarding the possible reasons behind some of the results that you're having. So for instance, the attitude towards mining. So for instance, do they have familiarity with it? For instance, a person talks about economic leakage. So I know that your survey was not qualitative, it was mostly quantitative for now, but do you have any inkling of what could also be explaining some of the dynamics that you see? So for instance, another person is asking, have you observed differences of response between ages for the oil and gas moratorium or for the mining questions, for instance? So if it would be possible to go a little bit more into the demographics and perhaps also from your own expertise, if it would be possible to maybe give some insights of why people answer the way they answered. Thank you.
I would say this is the $1 million question. The why, and I think a lot have to do with the exposure to information, especially when you look at threats. Which one is the most significant threats? What we saw, however, on some of those questions anyway, conservative voters seems to think alike when it comes to economic development. So we're seeing a drive. So when I said, well, still a majority of conservative voters back the moratorium, but for NDP voters or liberal voters, this is kind of almost a 70-30 issue, right? 70% support, 30% oppose. For conservative voters, it's close to 50-50. So right there, we're seeing kind of an important divide. Same thing for mining. You're seeing an important divide there. Now the question is, are those individuals kind of thinking this way because they vote conservative or because they're influenced by more a conservative media ecosystem? We didn't test for that. This is going to be a future version of the survey to kind of test which media from which media they're getting their information from.
Mirva, is there anything that you would like to add to that?
In general, I would say that, like Mathieu was pointing out, that is the big question, and then we will address more of these factors later on, where we manage to work on the data a little bit further and contextualize it, and then turn those into academic articles than where we are at the moment. This is what I would say.
Thank you. Jumping a little bit on what you mentioned about the next steps. doing survey in the North can be quite challenging. And there is a person asking about the challenges about reaching more northern communities and remote. You did talk about the financial aspect of that. It is more expensive to conduct surveys in the North. Would you be able to expand a little bit on, on the challenges, but also the successes in reaching the communities of the North, of the 3 territories?
Yeah. Just to put that in an order of perspective, we did a survey with Southerners last summer, and for the same price, you would get 2,000 respondents in the South. You get 600 in the North. So the difficulty is there and is not likely to go away, sadly. It just means that we need, as a country, to put in more resources in order to poll Northerners. The difficulty is especially in reaching out people. You need to limit the number of questions as well, because polling firms will tell you if the more you add questions, so we had to scrap 3 or 4 questions, because the more you add questions, the less likely you have respondents. People will just give up. And if you ever received a call from a polling firm, I did. I study surveys, and sadly, I have to say that I didn't went through because it was too long. It took 30, 40 minutes of my time. I just gave up. And I work with polls. I should have been the first one to stick around and answer the survey, but I didn't. So that's a pretty important question. It's also, you need to poll with landlines. So you need to reach out people with traditional landline, which is more of a challenge. It's more expensive and it takes more time. So the question format is also impacted. When you do an online survey, you can have long questions or longer questions anyway, and you can ask people to put in order of preference from 1 to 4, or you can't really, it's more difficult. You could do that, but it's more difficult when you do that using landlines, because it's just the poll will be longer and you're less likely to get people, and it's more long-winded questions are maybe not the way to go. With web panels, easier to get respondents.
On that, it's actually a personal question here. In the North, we also have other languages. So, for instance, in Inuktitut, just to name one, would you have seen perhaps a difference in response in asking those questions in, for instance, Inuktitut versus in English? Or is this something, for instance, I know this is the first one of hopefully an annual tradition. Do you think that in the future it would be something that you could consider of trying to use that linguistic metric here as well to generate results?
It could be an option. However, I don't think polling firms would have employees speaking those languages. So I don't know, but I don't think so. So that would be that would be harder to get polling firms to have people speaking these languages. On that note, I know they're trying to do that in Greenland with colleagues in Nuuk. They're a bit tired of hiring a polling firm that is quite expensive, because you need to hire people speaking local language in Greenland. So to have a kind of organic in-house solution at the University of Greenland doing surveys with native speakers. I don't know, however, I don't think Rasmus is in the room today. I don't know where that effort is at, but I think it's commendable. It's valuable. I hope it would culminate, but it just highlights the difficulty of doing this.
Let's see with the creation of the Inwinunangat University. Mirva, you also had something.
Just a quick add onto this discussion, but I think that, like, from the respondents' perspective, gaining trust and being able to talk in your own mother tongue would be easier, and that how to say, this connection, or like I said, that even polling is based on trust. So when you are calling to people and not just asking them to fill in a form on the website or so forth. So getting that trust of the respondents would probably be easier through using the local languages.
And I love projects. That would be an amazing project. Ambitious, but would be fascinating project to think about. Yeah.
Great. I'm holding you on that, Mathieu. There's another question. So we covered topics like mining, like security, but there's a person that would be interested in other topics. So for instance, here, particularly traveling. So were respondents asked about what they think about their ability to travel, for instance, across territories in other parts of Canada. We're hearing news about air traveling becoming very expensive in the north and residents not really having a choice. So the question, so to expand on that question, is basically, we've seen the topics that you talked about today. Did you cover any other topics? And if you have any insight, for instance, on traveling?
No, there was not. There was not a question on traveling. I should say, however, this is very interesting. I'm taking notes. I'm taking mental notes. So that would be an extremely interesting one. I saw also about the question about leakage. What if revenues or jobs around mining projects would stay more in the community rather than the fly in, fly out approach, that structure that many mining projects have in place in the north? That would also be quite an interesting question. I'm taking notes. I should say, if you have suggestions of questions to add, or even if you're a researcher and you want to work with this data, feel free to write to me or to contact us at OPSA to because we could share data and we can work together on the analyses. Maybe Anna, another open call for projects. I should maybe stop opening new projects, but this kind of an open projects for all interested.
You mentioned Greenland, so this is also opening a whole other can of worms, specifically on that questions of, I realize, so I'm reading here, I realize some of these questions are specific to Canada, but are there some comparison that you can make with other Arctic countries? Of course, you mentioned the elephant in the room, Greenland, but perhaps also other Arctic countries, for instance, Mirva over in Scandinavia. So yes, would you have any insights there?
And I would like maybe Mirva talk about it, because I don't know how the type of initiatives in place to survey just northern respondents in Norway, for example, and what would it mean? Where do you put the line of the high north? But maybe Mirva, if you want to talk about, are there other initiatives in Norway polling northerners?
Not that I'm aware of at the moment, but when we were planning this this survey, we were also considering of having that exactly the same questions to be asked amongst the northerners in Norway, and then we drew the line in Nordland, so one of the fylke, or one of the areas in northern Norway, so that the Finnmark and Troms would have been covered in Nordland as well. But unfortunately, we didn't, how to say this, the funding didn't cover that part of the survey this time, so we needed to leave that part out. But I agree, it would be very interesting, also because of the Arctic. Quite often people think that the Arctic is more or less the same, and the conditions are more or less the same throughout the regions, but those are very different in comparison to if you compare, for example, the European Arctic or Russian Arctic and then the American Arctic. So it will be interesting to see if the results are different, of course, given the existing geopolitical attentions here and there. So that's what I can say at the moment. I know we are carrying out similar kind of surveys throughout Norway, but then it would be probably possible to extract the northern parts. But I'm not so familiar that I would be able to say this for sure.
I'm pretty sure the demographics would be a bit. We're talking about different regions altogether. If we're thinking Tromsø, for example, compared to, well, there's no city of that magnitude in the Canadian Arctic, which makes the maybe comparison interesting, but the parallels would be really hard to draw. I think you could look at the efforts done at the University of Greenland recently by Maria Akren and Rasmus Nielsen as initiatives going in the same direction of pulling Northerners. Of course, their question, ours were really Canadian focused, theirs were really Greenland focused of, should we have a navy? Should we become an independent country? Should we join, should NATO be more involved? So those were different questions reflecting just the debate over there. I should highlight also that often when you develop those questions, you want to make sure that you don't go too specific into examples that maybe respondents have no idea about. Because what will unfold is that you will get a lot of don't know, no response, or don't know, because people don't have the knowledge or the amount of information required to answer these questions. So that's why we try to stick to questions that were closely related to the Canadian North, so people could have an idea of what we were mentioning was about.
Thank you. So we have 10 minutes left together, and we've received quite a few questions regarding methodology, so 3. So I would like to go through them first, and then we also have some content-specific questions, for instance, regarding the framing of US as a threat. So the first methodological question is about, so I'm reading here, I wonder if we were able to identify cross-groups/clusters that share same views on industrial developments and climate change/defense issues. For instance, just to name one example, is it possible to describe these clusters? So you were mentioning, for instance, the differences with the conservatives, the NDP, and the liberals. Are there any other kinds of cross groups and clusters that you can pinpoint to?
I will crunch the numbers soon. so today was more for aggregate data, but definitely we will crunch the numbers a bit more in details to see which variables were significant, statistically significant. We did that for the poll last summer, and we're able to get into kind of specific profiles. So there were people pro-environment. So there were Arctic Arctic protector, right, protect the environment. There was Arctic defender, right, pro-military. There were Arctic kind of builders, more for building infrastructures. There were Arctic entrepreneurs were at the bottom for Southerners. So kind of the economic development was at the very bottom in the Southerners' mind. We'll try to do the same for this one, to kind of extract profiles of respondents and what their social demographic variables were, but still a project TBD. It's coming.
Thank you. The second methodological question would be about the sample. How did that work out, basically? Would there be any way to run a survey in a consistent way with similar numbers of questions and budget, but a larger sample size? So you already touched a little bit on that. How was the sample frame constructed and the sample selected? So these are more perhaps pointed question also with the firm that you collaborated with for the survey. So yes, if you can just expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, maybe I can expand. I relay with them. So the firm was Ecos, based in Ottawa. Been doing this for decades. The sample was selected from the 3 territories, so it was a representative sample from the 3 territories. The sampling method, however, allowed for randomization, so we have a margin of error of about 4%. At one point, the decision was, do we go an extra 2 weeks? Because already the poll ran for 3 weeks, which if you look at polls done in the South is a pretty long period of time because, events unfold and developments happen. So the people at the beginning of the poll that answered at the beginning of the poll were exposed to the same events that the ones answering 3 weeks down the road. So we had that kind of question of, do we try to expand to 700 respondents? But that would have meant an extra 2 weeks because the response rate was pretty low. Other question was to expand maybe to northern Quebec, for example, Nunavik communities or communities in northern Labrador. We decided not to include those last two jurisdiction because the time frame would have just been longer. It would just take longer. I'm seeing another question of Giuseppe about the engage. Maybe I can address that now.
Yes. That was going to be the next question, but please go ahead.
So we did pre-testing, but this was very much conducted as a traditional survey of, there's not a lot of engagement before. You would see in a maybe more qualitative or focus group or field work. So it was more done as a traditional kind of survey. You call people and you get their answer. The pre-testing, however, kind of allow us to remove some questions that were maybe not as relevant, or we didn't see variations really on those questions. So, and for some, it didn't ring a bell. So pre-testing allows you to kind of trim and filter that some questions are maybe not as relevant, or you're not going to see tremendous variation. So what's the point of asking a question if 95% of people support or agree with something in itself? But I mean, would like to see where people position themselves thinking there's variations.
There are a few discussions in the chat regarding also questionnaires. So you were mentioning the calling people. Melissa then answers that there would be some internet connectivity issues regarding questionnaires. But is this an option that you considered as well, or what was your response methods?
Oh, it was dual. So I need to go back to the numbers, but about, I think 150 were collected via questionnaires, but 450, so the majority of it was landline. And this is kind of a traditional way that they dealt with this at ICOS with polls in the north, although they didn't do a lot of them. But for example, Mirva was mentioning the rethinking the top of the world poll. They did these two. But thinking that people 10 years ago or 15 years ago were more likely to respond than now. So on their end, they saw an evolution that people are less likely to answer now than they were 10 or 15 years ago.
Thank you. There is a content pointed question about the framing of US as a threat. This person would like to talk a little bit more about what generated the questions about the numbers and then implications also in time. So for instance, you made a comparison with the early 20-teens and the mid 20-teens. Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit about the context which motivated that question and also the responses that you got?
Mirva, maybe it would be interesting to get your opinion from Norway about perception of the US threat. That question was really about asking which country represent the most significant threat, leaving that open, thinking before we think about US, China, well, US for historical reason, for a long time, we thought, Northwest Passage, sovereignty crisis. We actually asked that question to Southerners a year ago in the summer of 2024. So in the before Trump era, we can call it that way. And I think it was about 60% of respondents picked Russia. The US was only picked by 10 or 12% of people as the #1 threat. So this was a remote threat before Trump. It was seen just as maybe people thinking of the Northwest Passage or thinking historically of those, contestation, but nothing significant. To see that number now in the North, it's a different sample altogether, but to see that, to me, is a huge shift of looking at the US as a threat in Canada. And Northerners are definitely sharing that perception. And China's a remote third. In fact, China is at the same stage that they were for Southern respondents a year ago. So the perception, in my mind, didn't really change there. But definitely, and we need to confirm that with a sample of Southern respondents, but a lot of people thinking Russia's the #1 threat just shifted to US now as the #1 threat.
Thank you. Mirva, any words as well?
I would say that the situation regarding Northern Europe is very different in comparison to what it is in Canada. I haven't heard Trump saying yet that they want Norway to be that 52nd state of the United States. Then, so that I think here the problem is more that the Europeans want to ensure the USA some kind of commitment to the security in the European. In Europe and in the US commitment to the European security, and especially in the north, which is which strategic importance, Northern Europe, I mean now, which strategic importance is getting bigger than it has been previously. So that is more of the question there than thinking that United States is threat through invasion. It's more like a threat through withdrawal, possible withdrawal, I would say.
Thank you. This concludes at 10:59. This concludes our panel for today, our conference. So thank you again to Professor Landriault and Professor Salminen for their insights and for all of their work. I shared in the chat the link to the overall publications of OPSA, where you can also find the surveys that have been done in the past as well. This survey will be published there as well. Relatively soon. Well, Mathieu, you gave me the timeline.
Next hour. Next hour.
In the next hour, there you go. And yeah, I'm looking forward to doing this again with other surveys and perhaps even more insights about the data extraction as well. So thank you everyone who joined, and see you next time.